Here is a man who spent 40 years being called a scientist by people who wanted to stop thinking about poverty, and a racist by people who wanted to stop reading him. Both responses are wrong, and both are convenient. The actual problem with Charles Murray is more interesting than either camp admits, and it lives entirely inside his methodology. Charles Murray is a political scientist turned public intellectual who achieved notoriety in 1994 with the Bell Curve, co-authored with Richard Herrnstein, and has spent the decades since elaborating its framework in successive books, Human Accomplishment, which ranks civilizations by intellectual output, and he is affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute. He writes with apparent clarity, marshals tables and citations with conscientiousness, and presents himself as someone following the data wherever it leads, regardless of social cost. Something we will need to inspect. What Murray actually does beneath the empirical apparatus is establish a measurement at one level of reality and then travel without declaring the journey to conclusions that belong to an entirely different level. He begins with psychometrics, which is a legitimate if contested field. IQ scores are heritable within populations. IQ scores predict certain outcomes. Both of these claims have evidence behind them. Murray then slides from these individual-level statistical regularities into claims about group differences, then into claims about civilizational productivity, then into claims about what meritocratic sorting feels like from the inside, what it does to social fabric, what the resident of a declining working-class zip code experiences as meaninglessness. Each move is performed as a continuation of the previous one. The same declarative register, the same vocabulary. The evidentiary standard quietly evaporates. The structural error in the bell curve is not subtle. Indeed, individual heritability coefficients tell you nothing about the source of differences between groups, unless you have controlled for environmental conditions at the population level. And Murray does not do that, and the reason he does not do that is that his framework has no room for the mechanisms that would require it. Behavior geneticists made this point with notable patience in the years following publication. The canonical illustration is this: take a genetically diverse set of seeds, split them into two batches, grow one batch in rich soil and one in depleted soil. The heritability of height within each batch can be high. The difference in average height between the batches is entirely environmental. Murray's inferential move from within-group heritability to between-group genetic explanation requires him to have established that the two groups grew in equivalent soil. He never establishes this. He never seriously attempts to. The scale error becomes more spectacular in Human Accomplishment, where Murray attributes differential rates of scientific and cultural production across civilizations to underlying cognitive capital, as though the institutional conditions that make sustained inquiry possible, funding structures, norm systems, theological permissions, network effects among researchers, are mere noise around a psychometric signal. The sociology of scientific production has documented in considerable detail how discoveries cluster around institutions, around moments of resource concentration, around specific kinds of intellectual infrastructure. Murray's explanatory scheme has no room for any of this because civilization in his model is essentially a large individual. Its dynamics emerge from structures and resource flows that have no counterpart at the level of the single skull, and treating one level as a scalar extension of the other is not a simplification, it is a category error that defeats understanding from the first move. Coming apart adds methodological subjectivism to the architecture. The cognitive elite as a self-sealing bubble is Murray's central metaphor, and it is defective in an illuminating way. A bubble is homogeneous inside, has a sharp boundary, and a single identified enclosing mechanism. The social formation Murray is actually describing has unclear edges, varying permeability depending on domain, and no specified mechanism by which selectivity translates into the particular attitudinal and behavioral divergences he then catalogs. The metaphor makes everything feel explained before a single process has been identified. That is not a rhetorical accident. It is the engine of the book. His examples throughout are illustrative rather than demonstrative. The zip code quiz, the Fishtown composite, the Belmont family, these are exhibits selected for their vividness and their fit with the structure already in place. They cannot be interrogated for the disconfirming case because they were never assembled by a procedure that would require encountering one. And when Murray moves from these exhibits to attributing interior states, alienation, condescension, the loss of meaning, to aggregate populations as observed social facts, he is no longer doing social science in any recognizable sense. He is doing phenomenological conjecture dressed in the vocabulary of behavioral genetics, and the dressing is doing all the epistemological labor. What his system consistently ignores, and the consistency is itself diagnostic, is everything that would crack the architecture. Environmental toxicology and its documented effects on cognitive development. Developmental neuroscience on plasticity. The unsettled literature on measurement invariance across groups, on stereotype threat, on the political history of psychometrics as an enterprise. Institutional racism as a causally efficacious structure rather than a sentiment. Any one of these bodies of knowledge, taken seriously, would require Murray to rebuild his explanatory scheme from the foundation. Together they dissolve it. The fact that they are absent from the framework is not an oversight. A thinker of Murray's intelligence and industry does not accidentally omit the literatures most directly relevant to his central claims. He operates at the level of statistical pattern and rhetorical narrative simultaneously, and the two register shifts are never declared, because declaring them would require acknowledging that he has left the domain of examinable processes and entered the domain of civilizational storytelling. Sure, cognitive ability varies, it is partially heritable, it predicts outcomes across a range of domains, and the clustering of cognitively selected populations in specific institutions and geographies is a real social phenomenon worth studying. The problem is not what he notices. It is what he does with it once the observation has been made. Charles Murray is a man performing empirical rigor at the level of individual measurement while drawing conclusions at the level of civilization and attributing causal mechanisms he has never identified to processes he has never examined. His books feel like science because they are structured like science. They are not science. They are a literary argument about hierarchy dressed in tables that mistakes the map for the territory at every level above the first. If that landed, subscribe. Next week, a thinker who makes Murray look epistemically cautious.